Hello and welcome to Chile Talk. I'm Neil Davidson. I'm with Pete Lee. We made an episode in which we asked, is Chile a nation? I think we concluded that it was. And now we have to ask, is Chile a Western nation? So the ideal way of proceeding now would be to define what we mean by Western, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Pete? You do that.
Wow, quite a task. Western. I think when we talk about the West and Western civilization, we're talking about perhaps a slightly obsolescent notion of an agreed idea of a cultural paradigm, a broad cultural paradigm that accepts that there are other cultural paradigms, most importantly the East, various forms of the East, and is not completely exclusionary of those other cultural paradigms, but nevertheless has some sort of integrity in its own terms.
And of course, I suppose, a common history. So we had Greek and Roman antiquity that our languages, or ancient Europe, our languages came from. We had the Middle Ages, we had the Enlightenment. Everybody was very marked by the French Revolution, that kind of thing.
Yes, something around a continuity of historical narrative is important. By the time you start wanting to defend Western civilization, you're probably missing the point.
Or it was probably already finished. That's right. That's right, because I suppose what it is hard to define by is by values, really, because we talk about values of freedom, whatever, democracy, I don't know. But these are not historically intrinsic to Western civilization,
no.
Are they? We had slavery, we've had numerous dictatorships. It rather reminds me, I'm old enough to remember a few years back when China was just emerging, and they wanted to define themselves against the West, since they were copying all the West stuff, not all of it, not for example democracy, but a lot of their stuff, the West stuff, and they came up with this thing called Asian values, and they were things like hard work, discipline, respect for parents, and it was just Victorian values.
Yes, well, probably Singapore was the most advanced centre for defining those things, and Singapore, obviously an ex-British colony that has quite a few nifty bits of British common law traditions and other educational traditions, which it can supplement with its Asian values, and has done extremely successfully.
Yes.
I think when we talk about particularly East and West, we must take those terms as very generous.
That's right.
Ideal types that overlap a lot.
Yeah. So basically, we're ducking the issue. Okay, we're not going to really try and define what the West is. Everybody knew once, because the rest was advanced, it was innovative, it was white, and so on. And now it's not so clear.
Well, in the Chilean press, I think we've gone back to talking about the Western countries after, for a time, talking about the developed countries, because Chileans were certain that Chile was becoming a developed country. Now we seem to have gone back to talking about the Western countries to mean countries somehow like Chile.
Right, so Chile does consider itself, the Chilean authorities, the Chilean governments consider Chile to be a Western country.
I believe so. So.
But this isn't necessarily the case with everybody. My daughter's doing an art degree, and the University of Chile, at least in the art department, being a fairly sclerotic organisation, hasn't got round to, you can call it either modernising the curriculum or dumbing it down, depending upon your viewpoint. And they teach art history, Egypt, ancient Greece and Rome and so on, as they always have done. And after an art history lesson, the new students asked questions such as, why is Chile so Eurocentric? And the teacher's reply was, because we were colonised by a European country, speaking a European language, introducing European laws, European art. So kind of obviously Chile's Western, isn't it?
Well, of course, interrogating your Eurocentricity is a very Eurocentric thing to do these days. Yes, it's interesting. When tourists in particular follow the spine of the Andes down the continent, often when they arrive in Chile, they decide that it's considerably more Western.
That's right.
That's how they describe it, as opposed to countries such as Peru and Bolivia and Ecuador and Colombia.
And the question is, do they simply mean more developed, because that is no longer synonymous with being Western, or do they mean more Western? I think, so one thing is this historical stuff, the economic stuff. Another thing is the kind of your visceral experience of when you encounter people. I've always thought Chile was Western because a Bolivian, an indigenous Bolivian, of whom there are a great many, one has the stereotype of the impassive Indian. I grew up with that stereotype.
And when we say indigenous, of course, we mean generally speaking an indigenous language. That's an important part of the identity.
It is.
And there's very little of that in Chile.
That's right. But I guess even if an indigenous Bolivian spends a lot of their life in Spanish, they would still have cultural traits that one would recognise as being perhaps rather more consistent with what's understood to be the main origin of indigenous peoples in the Americas, which is East Asia, that they're supposed to have crossed the Bering Strait many thousands of years ago.
Yes.
And then when we think of East Asia, we think of the Japanese, we think of sort of the inhabitants of Kamchatka and these places in Siberia, who seem to have the same characteristics. They seem to us impassive. Perhaps they're only impassive around us, but that's our experience. That's a big one. They have a different worldview in many respects, but that's the first thing you notice. Whereas in Chile, people are not impassive, for example, on the whole. To me, the average middle class, upper middle class Chilean is quite recognisably European. I couldn't say from what country, but European. And working class Chileans seem to me very much like Londoners. They like la talla, as it's called here, kind of banter, taking the piss, all that kind of thing that you don't associate with, say, the Japanese, but you do associate with at least a certain type of Western. They just seem to be like normal. It's like walking to a London cafe or pub. It's the same in Chile. It seems much the same kind of people. What's your visceral kind of experience?
Well, my sense of when tourists, for example, describe Chile as more Western, I think it's generally quite superficial observation. There are McDonald's here, or
I see. It's not a profound cultural analysis.
There are streets, yes, compared to the more traditional architecture, that is to say, often pre-Hispanic architecture in other parts, and of course, yes, the factor of indigenous languages being spoken in tourist towns, often for touristic purposes. Whereas the Chileans, yes, are a mestizo people of different shades, and we've spoken about that before under the topic of pigmentocracy. And a lot of people who visit Chile see it as, in terms of its level of development, it hasn't quite reached developed status, which is associated with the first world, the idea of liberal democracy and development. The democracy here is a little bit tetchy, but it does have a democratic system of sorts, as do virtually all Latin American countries. And
that's right, perhaps a little more paternalist than we're used to, but we'll talk about that under the heading of populism one day. Mm-hmm.
And the development, it's certainly the old Cold War distinction between third world and first world, of course second world being planned economies, communism or socialism, doesn't seem to apply very comfortably here.
Right.
And you hear some tourists talk about the less developed areas being more third world, and the areas that have gated communities and such as being first world, which of course is a very third world way to organise your wealthy areas.
That's right. In lots of ways, you look at the United States, if you're not from there, of course, I suppose, and you think, my gosh, it looks like a lot of it looks like the third world. And then, of course, you realize, no, of course, it's not the United States looks like the third world. The third world looks like the United States. That's the model they're trying to imitate.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes. Well, I think in as much as you might consider Chile to be unlike the other Andean countries, by comparison with the other side of the mountains, certainly Argentina, Uruguay, the south of Brazil, we also see a considerable break in the culture, I think, as well. Chileans are very enthusiastic about describing themselves as Southern Cone, because obviously the country, Chile, goes all along the Southern Cone, the triangle that sticks out the bottom of South America. I'm not sure that on the other side people speak so much about Southern Cone. They'll talk about Rio Platense, of the River Plate area, such as Buenos Aires and Montevideo, in the south of Brazil too, in some sense.
Got it. So there's an unrequited feeling of kinship. The Chileans often talk about, los hermanos argentinos, our Argentinian brothers, and they complain that the Argentinians talk about them as, los hermanitos chilenos, our little Chilean brothers.
Or los chilotes, the people from Chiloé, a small island, very classically Chilean mestizo island.
That's right. And I think it's true to say, actually, that, of course, when I was talking about my own reaction to the Chileans, I'm largely talking about the capital. And I guess in the countryside, there's a kind of formalism, a sort of courtesy. Chilean society is, on the whole, probably more courteous than, say, British society, and I think it certainly is.
Yes.
There's more formalism. There are more kind of elaborate greetings. People are more sticklers for greeting properly, for handshakes, for kisses, for calling people caballero. A stranger will often call you gentleman to your face. There's the usted, the formal form. So I suppose one can see perhaps a trace of, but is it Orientalism or is it simply slightly just by our standards being old-fashioned?
Well, by another token, I mean, Santiago, for a city with 7 million people, is extremely provincial in many respects in terms of culture, particularly what we'd recognise as kind of canonical European culture, both the fine arts and also more of an easygoing popular culture that's more connected to the increasingly international concept of popular culture, is relatively weak, particularly on the production side, compared to Buenos Aires or Montevideo or Sao Paulo. For a city with some 7 million people, it's almost as if it has urbanized without civilizing. People have come in from the countryside, forgotten their country courtesy, and simply occupied the space.
Yeah, there is that feeling. It's been noticeable that when I first arrived here, you were seeing people driving cars who clearly had only stepped in a car for the first time quite recently.
Yes.
There was a lot of mutual mistrust, the kind of thing of country people suddenly being forced to live very close together and not really knowing what to think of it all.
Yes.
And you felt this great sort of people leading very separate lives. And
I think several generations on, it hasn't really gelled into.
I think it is starting to gel. I think there's been a change. And there was the after effect of the dictatorship, of course, when I first arrived, which I think made people distrustful. And I do believe it is starting to gel, and there is more of an urban feeling. I remember an artist called Carlos Altamirano saying that Santiago was that London and Paris were what Santiago could never hope to be, great cities.
Yes.
And he regarded this as simply impossible. And now I think I can kind of see it. I can kind of imagine it becoming a great city, not just a big city. I can conceive it now. I can sort of
we'll have to rebuild quite a bit of the recently built architecture to get anywhere near there, I'd say.
Well, that's true. That's true. That's right.
An idea that is quite interesting comes from the French political theorist and sociologist Alain Rouquier, which is that Latin America and perhaps Hispanic culture in general, Iberic culture in general, is the far west. So this picks up on the idea that it's a contingent part of the West, but it's also almost a quintessence of Westernness that's further away.
That kind of makes sense. For a start, it's a Catholic continent, of course, famously, and we tend to think of the West as associating the West with innovation, wealth, success. We tend to associate it with perhaps more the Nordic countries. Spain was not a great scientific innovator. It was not a great innovator. Italy kind of burnt itself out with the Renaissance. But in another way, Protestantism is not very Western, is it? I mean, there's a great chapter in James Fraser's The Golden Bough, where he talks about called Oriental Religions in the West, where he complains that in Republican times, native Greek and Roman religion, the individual was always subordinated to the greater good and to the interests of the state. And an individual might refuse to sacrifice his life for his country, but he knew very well he was acting basely. And then there was this great popularity of the Oriental religions, the religion of the Great Mother, all these a whole series that came out of Syria and so on, of which, of course, the principal one was Christianity. And suddenly, instead of being about the greater good, your business was to cultivate your own soul and worry yourself about its fate in the afterlife, and hang the community. And that, of course, describes Protestantism, which got rid, as far as it could, of its pagan past, just centered to destroy images, and had this obsessive concern with this welfare of the soul. Whereas Catholicism actually kept a lot of the native Western tradition, didn't it? The pagan tradition, in the form of Virgin Marys and saints and all that. So I guess Catholic Latin America is in that way more Western than Protestant Northern Europe.
Yes, including its syncretistic elements with Amerindian religion, which is very much encouraged by the current Latin American Pope, Francis. There is a sense of it being more strongly Western than other parts of the West. And that is convincing. Yes, and if we compare Chile to Buenos Aires, for example, Buenos Aires has a very strong connection to Western culture as we know it. Yes,
that's right. Buenos Aires was one of the great cities on the European, or on the circuit of the wealthy, the people who had the money to travel, and they would go to London, Paris, New York. Buenos Aires, it was one of the great Western cities.
It had 50 great years from 1880, and then it's had a lot of problems over the last 90 years.
Yeah.
But certainly, clearly, a Western paradigm has been laid down there that's very convincing. I mean, if you think about rock music, well, the English-speaking countries do it, the Nordic countries can do it, Japan can do it, and Argentina can do it.
Right. And Chile kind of does it too, but it's
aspiring to be something like the Argentinian rock music. It's the quicker upper class thing. We can do this as well. We can do popular culture on behalf of our benighted countrymen.
That's right. And most Chileans listen to a lot of cumbia, don't they?
Yes, they seem to like the Latin Americanist sounds of.
That's right. And in the countryside, you still have a folk tradition of the Chilean native, cueca.
Yes, but the connection to the Western, it's intermittent. It's intermittent.
That's right. Now, if you look at the bigger picture, it's quite interesting, right? Because Latin America certainly has, I think, a kind of identity crisis or historical debt that hasn't paid off. I mean, the British have been left in no doubt that their empire was horrible, abusive, exploitative. Now, Latin American and North American, and of course the North Americans had slavery, for which they have to apologise. But they're proud of their independence movements, and the kind of narrative is that these nasty Europeans came over sat on and abused, exploited the indigenous inhabitants. But then these tremendous warriors for independence rose up, and they expelled these horrible Europeans, and everybody lived happily ever after. Because the trouble is, you look at the surnames of these great independence heroes. Here, I walked past a couple of busts in the street last night. One was Antonio José de Sucre, another was Simón Bolívar. That these people didn't have Mapudungun names, they had Spanish names. The American independence heroes...
They were Venezuelan,
they were Venezuelan,
to their credit.
But they were basically Spanish. I mean, if you step back and, don't look...
They didn't have Taino names or the other names.
That's right. And similarly, in North America, the great independence heroes had English surnames, Anglo-Saxon surnames. And so, in a way, this was kind of the biggest, probably, confidence trick in history, if you consider it from the point of view of the indigenous peoples. Suddenly, the nasty Europeans have gone, we're independent, but whoops, the same people are in charge.
Well, I mean, this is a big topic that we'll have
This
to
is a huge topic. But this has allowed people in South America and even in North America to regard themselves as the victims of European colonialists, even though the people who run the place are actually the heirs of the European colonialists. And so not only are they Western, but they've managed to also, if they're South American and fairly poor, they've managed to identify with the global South.
Yes, the global South is on the rise now, largely thanks to, Africa's obvious demographic riches and other riches. We're well over 1,000 million Africans now.
And they're going to be a big chunk of the world's population in the next decades.
Maybe as much as a third or even more of the world's population will be in Africa. And
it's as well to keep on the right side of them.
Yes, almost vicariously there is a Latin Americanist instinct to associate oneself with Africa in this global South.
That's right.
Against the iniquities of the world.
And it's not just self-interest. I mean, it's a genuine feeling that we too are poor, therefore we are victims. We know we were victims of European colonialism. We belong together. We are the exploited.
Yes, and we're post-colonial, even though we're supposed to have started the post-colonial thing 200 years ago, whereas Africa's only got 60 years of post-colonialism under its belt.
That's right. So part of one wonders how long they can string this out for.
Yes. It's a wonderful argument.
So I think, this is a whole different subject, which is this kind of original sin of Latin America, which is that the good old colonialists still run the place while pretending to be staunch anti-colonialists.
Yes, not all Chileans are Latin Americanist, and Chile is marked by an ability at times to centre itself on itself as a unit. And perhaps that has something to do with being such a long and unwieldy country.
That's right. We spoke about this in the last episode about Chile is in fact being a nation, a genuine nation. Yeah.
And I think Chile does feel like a genuine nation, and probably it feels like a Western nation, sincerely. One of the interesting exceptions that seems to prove the rule there is the relationship between Chile and the East. There's an interesting economist called Hassan Akram who is always pointing out to the Chileans that the commercial relationship with China is the most important one for Chile, and he's quite right about that. He's British. He's a very good speaker of Spanish, and the idea that the East is there, not just China but also India, Indic civilization. It's very interesting that the view that Chileans increasingly confect of the East seems to have to be refracted through Western framings. That is to say, Western beyond Chile framings of those things. So we have Chinese restaurants with their names in English.
That's right. So they're the ultimate Orientalists in Edward Said's formulation. That's right.
Thai restaurants with their names in English.
That's right.
Puns about Thais, korbatas.
That's right. That's right. Yes.
Yes. I actually like to make. Pad Thai using corbatas, the tie-shaped pasta, which I call Thai, because pad is noodle.
Of course.
Yes.
Of course. Well, there you have it then, the ultimate proof of Chile's Western identity. And I think on that note, we should probably call it a day, not weary our listeners. Thank you for joining us, and hope to see you again here on Chile Talk.
Many thanks.
So I don't know if we have more to say. I'm just worried we might be getting near the half hour. We should probably have a